Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle Jamie Perry. My name is Jamie Paris. I am introducing myself in English and French, in part because I am nodding to mischief, the hybrid sort of pidgin language that was spoken by the Métis peoples. I would love to be just introducing myself in my language. Unfortunately, I do not know it, and there is a long history of settler colonialism that leads to that. So I just want to say, I tear up a little bit every time I hear someone introduce themselves in their language, and I think that language revitalization and normalization work is just essential. I would like to thank Dr. Espinoza and Dr. Manning for the invitation to speak today, the University of Arizona for hosting us, and all the amazing hands behind Race Before Race who make this event possible. I'm coming today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, in Treaty 1 territory, in the lands of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dene, Ojai Cree, and the homeland of the Red River Métis people. My biological family includes Scottish settlers, Red River Métis traders, and Afro-Acadian peoples from Nova Scotia. My family name is in the Book of Negroes, and we are a historical Black family. I am, however, an orphan, and I'm disconnected from many of these biological roots, like too many young Indigenous people in my country, and I am not an enrolled member of the Métis Nation. I want to be clear about that. I was raised by my city, a land of rivers and prairies and snow, oh, so much snow. And I want to give those who came before me props as I write and speak today in hopes of a joyful Afro-Indigenous futurities. My people believe that being a good guest is honesty. In this way, I want to admit some trepidation coming to America for this event. Your government is openly threatening the political and economic sovereignty of my nation, and plans to make us the 51st state are unlikely to respect the treaties, Canada's unofficial constitution, that discusses how we will share the land together. I'm also deeply concerned about the troubling rhetoric and laws being passed against trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people. Historically, we have seen laws and rhetoric like this before as a prelude to genocide. I want my trans, two-spirit, and gender non-conforming students, colleagues, and audience members to know that I support you, that I think what is happening is unconscionable, and that I hope my government will take you in as refugees if the need arises. It is also important to note that the language of taking over the Gaza Strip and redeveloping it is the logic of genocidal colonization. Note that the logic is one of what Marx calls primary accumulation. The land is to be rebuilt into a tourist paradise for the world, apparently, but almost 2 million Indigenous people who are there are not to be compensated for the loss of their homes, their lands, and their ways of life. We can disagree about the conflict in the Middle East. I've been very clear on my politics. I believe this is a genocide, and I have several scholars I think would back that up. But either way, rewarding those who have destroyed hospitals, who have destroyed schools, who have destroyed entire university systems by allowing them to build a Riviera, it's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's only possible to be profitable because there is no plan to compensate the people of Palestine for taking their lands. These are troubling domestic and international policies. And while it's easy to blame one man or a group of radicals, what we are seeing is tragically consistent with a larger history of settler colonial exploitation of the lands, people, and more than human kin. The policies I'm seeing of dismantling and destroying government systems, bureaucratic takeover, are policies that we have seen, quite frankly, used against Indigenous peoples and communities all over Turtle Island. So I speak today with a heavy heart, but also from a place of radical hope. My hope is that through honesty, transparency, allyship, and political action, we can stop these policies now before they move on and harm millions of people. Thank you. Sorry, I said critical things about America in front of an American flag, I just realized. I'm not apologizing for that, saying critical things. I'm apologizing for standing in front of the flag. As settler scholar and dramaturge Rick Knowles notes, there's almost no Indigenous adaptations of Shakespeare in the lands now called Canada, and surprisingly few performances of the plays put on by Indigenous actors, by Indigenous directors, and produced in Indigenous spaces. Now, there are some important exceptions to this, including important stagings of Shakespeare's The Tempest in Toronto and Vancouver, Death of a Chief by Algonquin playwright and University of Manitoba graduate Yvette Nolan, and settler theatre maker Kendi C. McKinnon, and Cardinal's The Land Claim, or As You Like It. But on the whole, we do not see Indigenous adaptations or engagement with Shakespeare. And it tends to be, and if we see them, it tends to be because major theatre companies like the Stratford Shakespeare Theatre, the National Centre for the Arts, or Bard on the Beach has provided meaningful funding for the development of these plays. As Noel says, well, people want there to be an Indigenous Shakespeare for some reasons. The reasons are often contradictory. On the right, this is often about a desire to create art that proves that settler culture is universal, or that Indigenous peoples have become good enough to perform the highest of settler art through colonial education. On the left, there is a desire to see decolonial Indigenous adaptations that resist Shakespeare as, quote, an icon of imperial domination. Both of these settler desires for Indigenous Shakespeares place a focus on the need of an implicitly white settler audience to see Indigenous theatre, as neither of them seems particularly interested in listening to what Indigenous peoples themselves have to say about Shakespeare, think about Shakespeare, or if they even care about Shakespeare. One way to conceptualize this is when you go to the theatre in Canada, it is normal to have a land acknowledgement. Beautiful thing. I love land acknowledgements. But the land acknowledgement often talks as if the theatre is implicitly white and is situated on Indigenous land. And I often find as I'm sitting there listening to the land acknowledgements, where am I? Am I guest? Am I settler? What's the relationship I'm supposed to have to this acknowledgement? To me, an Indigenous Shakespeare would be one led by Indigenous people and communities, staged in venues that give money back to Indigenous communities, and that has actors from those communities. The production agreement in Say It's Where We Belong is a good ethical model for what this kind of work might look like going forward. And if you want an example of what this looks like in Canada, consider Cree artist Ren E. Lata-Akos Macbeth, and the way he uses the figure of the Windigo as a way of understanding Macbeth's greed and imbalance. In other words, we can do this work, and we can do it ethically, but there's a difference between doing it together and being asked to do it because nothing else will get produced. In 1976, Mohawk actor August Schellenberg and settler director John Giuliani began to theorize an all-Indigenous production of Shakespeare's King Lear at Canada's National Arts Centre in Ottawa. The goal of the production was to stage King Lear mostly intact, with the same language, characters, and settings as the original. As settler critic and dramaturge David Dean put it, the whole point was to prove that Indigenous actors were capable of performing Shakespeare as Shakespeare, unadapted and unmodernized. I just want to underline that, by the way. In a major scholarly journal, he used the word capable, and that was like the editors didn't stop that. Just pause on that for a second. When the National Theatre Centre opened in 1969 as a nation-building project encouraged by Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, however, the leadership judged the Schellenberg and Giuliani proposal to be premature on the grounds, in their assessment, that there were not enough Aboriginal actors or such actors with sufficient ability to perform Shakespeare without significant adaptation or alteration. I will note that in 1969, we were in the height of the residential school system. And if you think about the kind of illiteracy that created in Indigenous communities, there might be a reason why there weren't a ton of classically trained Indigenous actors. But I love the discourse of merits, where white people get to say they are not making a racist decision, but simply adjudicating the overall talent or ability of a group of Indigenous actors and finding them wanting. This paternalistic language positions the white judges as custodians of Shakespeare and as the only legitimate adjudicators of his work, as what Arthur Little Jr. has called white property. And then they get to say, not yet, to a group of artists because of the violence they might do to the text if they do not perform Shakespeare up to white standards. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. notes that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. When it is demanded, what those who want freedom are told is to wait, that they can have their freedom later, when they are ready for it, or when they assimilate enough in the eyes of the white judges. As King notes, this wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. In the case of an all-Indigenous production of Shakespeare, justice was delayed until Peter Hilton took up artistic leadership of the NAC in 2005. And even then, it was not until 8 May 2012 that a show finally went on stage. Apparently, it took 45 years for white people to decide that there were enough qualified Indigenous actors for a national company to put on a production of King Lear. The production was directed by settler artistic director Peter Hilton, and the setting is a late 17th century Algonquin community. A documentary was made about the production entitled Chasing Lear, highly recommended, directed by Laurie Cardinal. And while the play keeps most of the language the same, they got rid of some words that wouldn't have made sense within an Algonquin context. Thus, knights become warriors, castles become halls. In an Algonquin worldview, the land is not something one owns, and thus the idea of a king dividing the land between his daughters would have come across as nonsense. The play was set after the arrival of settlers, when there was a need to set aside some land for the settlers to share with Indigenous people. I want to underline the word share. King Lear is first produced in 1606, and the play theorizes the idea that Samuel de Champlain made his third voyage to the lands he called Quebec in 1608, and that by 1613, Champlain was exploring the Ottawa River Valley and making alliances with the Capuchin chief Tess Wee-Has on the same lands where NAC stands today in Ottawa. The play used period-appropriate costumes for a mid to late 16th century Algonquin setting and had a canoe that drifted across the waters. And it used a lot of circular imagery. The circular imagery, moreover, made the play feel more like an ensemble cast, where there was not so much a focus on Lear, his thoughts, feelings, and actions, as an isolated man battling against the elements, and more of a focus on the women in the play and their role as decision makers within the community. Sadly, much of the media focus on the production was on the ability of the actors and their marveling that Indigenous people could do a proper Shakespeare. The production thus became almost a referendum on the skill of Indigenous people performing Shakespeare rather than an artistic expression about Shakespeare. The question should have never been one of skill, but one of asking if a settler audience was ready to see an Indigenous Shakespeare. Indeed, in my current sort of book project, I would argue the answer to that is still no. That audiences want an Indigenous-themed Shakespeare, they want Indigenous actors on the stage, but that an Indigenous Shakespeare, one that is meaningfully Indigenous, is still something that is not broadly supported in the Canadian context. The goal was to have Telsi-Wat-Ut-Hun chief Dan George play the titular role of King Lear in the production. Unfortunately, George died in 1981, 14 years after the original plan to stage the production was launched. George is a residential school survivor and got his first acting role at the age of 60. And the CBC television series, Caribou County, if you ever want to watch a piece of Canadiana, Caribou County, and in 1970, he was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in Little Big Man. George will be best known to many of you for his 1967 speech, Lament for Confederation, where he powerfully argued that the previous 100 years of Confederation were a tragedy for Indigenous peoples. In the speech, George says, quotes, For I have known you, Canada, when your forests were mine, when they gave me my meat and my clothing. I have known you in your streams and rivers, when your fish flashed and danced in the sun, when the water said, come, come eat of my abundance. I have known you in the freedom of your winds, and my spirit, like the winds, once roamed your good lands. George here remembers a time of Indigenous autonomy and abundance, where his people lived sustainably with the land and were in turn taken care of by the lands that we now call Canada. George imagines a gift economy where people took what they needed but did not take more, where the fish offered themselves because we were good relatives to them, and where we didn't just take but had a sustainable relationship with. In contrast, he says, the time since the white man came has seen my freedom disappear like the salmon going mysteriously out to sea. George, that is, directly links the destruction of his community with the ecological destruction caused by the overfishing of settlers. Just as importantly, he says, that the white man's strange customs, which I could not understand, pressed down upon me until I could no longer breathe. A phrase that takes on a lot of resonances if we want to think about Afro-Indigenous solidarities. Settlers, or white men, George argues, are responsible for ecological destruction on the lands now called Canada and introduced an oppressive form of colonialism that literally took the breath or spirit from Indigenous peoples while destroying sacred relationships with the land and our more than human kin. When I read George's laments, I think of Yellowknife Dene theorist Glenn Sean Coulthard and the idea of indigenous anti-colonial nationalism that rejects policies, techniques, and ideologies explicitly oriented around genocidal exclusion, assimilation, double. As Coulthard argues, the way the settler state dealt with the anti-colonial nationalism was not to give people sovereignty, but to move to a seemingly more conciliatory set of discourses and institutional practices that emphasize our recognition and accommodation, but that remain colonial to its foundation. By colonial, Coulthard means a relationship characterized by domination, where power, in this case, interrelated discursive and non-discursive facets of economic, gendered, racial, and state power, has been structured into a relatively secure or sedimented set of hierarchical social relations that continue to facilitate the disposition of Indigenous peoples, of their lands, and self-determining authority. This is the logic that Australian Indigenous scholar Anne Moultrie Robinson calls the white possessive, or a set of logics that are used to rationalize, reproduce, and reaffirm the nation-state's ownership, control, and domination that becomes operationalized within the discourse to circulate sets of meanings about ownerships of the nation as part of a common sense knowledge, decision-making, and socially produced convention. This is why King Lear interests me, because King Lear is set at a moment where these logics of the white possessive are coming into focus. We're setting the play in sort of the late Bronze Age. King Lear believes the land is his possession, and it is his right to distribute that possession to his daughters, irregardless of the harm that might cause to any other groups of people. Importantly, he believes that he can separate the title of king from the responsibilities of being king. If we think of the responsibilities of being king in terms of being a relative or a relation, Lear wants to have all of the benefits of relationality and none of the responsibilities. Importantly for me, Lear also fundamentally misunderstands gift. That is, when Lear demands love from his daughters, professions of love, he takes something that should be given freely as a gift between family members, shows of respect, love, and devotion, and he turns it into a transactional event that can be used to determine who gets what land. Of course, this works out particularly poorly for him when his youngest daughter calls him on it, essentially saying that she is not going to play this game of turning love into a transactional economy. Lear's next response, though, fascinates me. Rather than going back to the map, sitting with his advisors, thinking calmly and critically about how we might divide the land now that Cordelia won't play the game, he instead redraws the map on the fly in front of everyone, dividing it in half along lines that don't particularly make sense. When I think of this, I think of the Canadian-American border, and I think about how many Indigenous communities are literally separated by that border because a line was drawn in a place that did not make sense, because the people who drew the line, quite frankly, didn't care about those who were going to be impacted by where the line was drawn. In this way, then, I want to end by thinking about the idea of the state of nature. And I want to do so through James Youngblood Henderson and his argument that settler ideas of the state of nature have always been associating nature with terror as a legitimate source of sovereign power and law that is concealed by the law but is never eliminated by legal interventions. Terror is the response to a state of nature as proposed by Thomas Hobbes. The state of nature, according to Hobbes, is our natural state where there is not a common centralized power to keep us in awe and obedience. The state of nature, Hobbes thought, there was a war of all against all, family against family, for scarce resources, and a time when the notion of rights and wrong, justice and injustice, there have no place. When there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. In the state of nature, Hobbes claims, there is no industry, culture, or knowledge, but simply a continual fear of imminent violent death, where the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This was used as a justification for the colonization of America. And Hobbes in particular talks about, quote, the savage people in many places in America, except the government of small farmers, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all, and live this day in a brutish manner. Hobbes' claim tells us nothing about what Indigenous people were doing, but it tells us everything about how colonization is about a gaze. It's about how do we look at another group of people. And what Hobbes says is don't look at this group of people and see peace, see fecundity, see abundance. Instead, look at them and project onto them the worst impulses you can imagine from European history, and then think about how we are freeing them from this. This is terrifying. And Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia takes this logic to its extreme. Scholars have long talked about the way that he talks about Indigenous people, so I'm not going to cover any of that here today. Instead, I want to note the way that he talks about the land. Harriot's document is a document for primary accumulation. He makes the case that, look, there probably isn't gold and other easily potable natural resources, but you know what there is? Pretty much everything else. And what if you just took it? What if you just went there because this was a gift and loaded up your ship and went away? In other words, colonization created the very state of nature, the war of all against all, that was used to justify the colonial project. This is very much the tail wagging the dog. Now, none of this is new, but what is new, or at least what I think is interesting here, is Harriot rejects the idea that nature is a gift. The idea that when you get a gift, you have responsibilities that come with that gift. And in this way, I find it fascinating that when Lear is in a state of near madness, he sees Tom, and he says, I've taken too little care of this. And it could be that I've taken too little care of this as a direct reference to Tom and the poor, but I think it's also plausible that the this here is a reference to this, to the land and the environment. And he starts calling Tom a philosopher. Tom talks about his ability to hunt. Tom talks about his ability to eat frogs, toads, tadpoles, newts in the water. He says he hunts mice and rats and small deers. And Lear looks up to him as a philosopher, and I want to suggest a philosopher who he thinks is offering him an indigenous worldview, a worldview where he can live sustainably in the forest, away from his ungrateful daughters. Of course, Tom's a charlatan. He is not an indigenous person. He is not a bedlam beggar. He is the child of nobility who has blackened his face, hat tip to Ayanna Thompson here, and has very much put on a performance that has fooled Lear. In this way, I find it fascinating at this moment of colonization how many people are suddenly pretending to indigeneity and wisdom. When I was growing up, if you were a mixed kid like me, you did anything you could to not say you were indigenous. And now I am finding people everywhere who are telling me they are Métis. I love this in some ways, and I hope that this is because people are legitimately looking at their family trees, reestablishing connections. But I worry that some of it is because they believe it is property. It is something of value that can be exchanged. Even there, I kind of think, you know what, that's between you and your gods. You live your life. But it's when people start saying, I have wisdom. I know indigenous worldviews, and that wisdom starts replacing actual indigenous scholars, elders, and knowledge keepers' wisdom that I find frustrating. In other words, I see Lear as a story that imagines a kind of colonial recovery, but it imagines one without indigenous people, and therefore one that cannot work. And I would suggest to you guys today, as we're looking at a moment where we actually need a recovery from the evils of settler colonialism, and we're seeing them full force in the American government, the recovery won't happen without indigenous people. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if people have them. Or to go off into the wilderness if people don't.
Jamie, thank you for that talk. I will admit with shame that I love King Lear. It's a great play, but I'm curious about the other side of what you were gesturing at, and that's the constructions of whiteness for these plays, and maybe thinking about Terence starting us off, and in a play like King Lear, and that moment that you are pressing on, which when he's in the storm, and it is in nature, and he says, these poor and houseless heads, right? So he's thinking of the populace as well. I wonder if you can kind of unpack a little bit, right, and your thoughts on this. I like your attention to, kind of virtue signaling, right, thinking about these indigenous knowledges, right, that might be in place in that play. But the other side of that coin is how the play attends to that construction of whiteness, right, and thinking about that populace and how notions of English identity via that whiteness are being shaped both internally within the play, right, but also, as you suggest, in 1606, right? And put that in conversation with how you see that playing out, the bigger picture.
So what I've argued elsewhere is that whiteness as a political construction only makes sense in the context of colonialism. That is, you've got to convince people to take a psychological wage in order to make the primary accumulation cost effective. It's incredibly expensive to do colonial work. So when we talk about Lear seeing and acknowledging the houseless heads, on the one hand, I love teaching that moment because it's a beautiful moment of a leader realizing he has failed. But you'll notice that he doesn't actually offer a solution. That is, he doesn't offer to take some of his retainers and house the heads. He doesn't bring the heads in. Tom is cold and very much wants to go in and have the food. Lear wants to stay outside in the weather. Right? This fundamental misunderstanding. And to me, that is kind of the essence of whiteness. That a lot of people who don't actually benefit from white supremacy will still take up the position of seeing themselves as part of the we of King Lear. right? But if you take on that position of being part of the we, are you housed? So as I watch the rise of white supremacy on Turtle Island, and I watch the rise of a kind of neo-white supremacy, it's not a surprise to me that a lot of it's coming from poor communities. Communities that have struggled economically for a long time and have been told that you are houseless not because of what you have done, but because someone else got it. Now it's DEI, before that it was affirmative action. There's always some boogeyman who white people are told got things instead of you. And what interests me is, what if we started to imagine whiteness and the solidarity whiteness implies not as an alliance between the king and people, between the wealthy and the houseless, but between all of us who are houseless. That is, what if poor white people in Appalachia started to look at the people in Palestine and go, hey, we know what it looks like to have an entire town destroyed. We see you and we want to work with you, right? What if we start building those kind of relationships that I will note, if you start looking at like the larger colonial history, this was a huge anxiety of the colonist, that poor white people would come to America and they would see themselves primarily in terms of a relationship with indigenous peoples or black peoples, rather than seeing themselves in terms of white landowners. So I think you're right, there's a really interesting history there. And I also want to just note here, while Lear is ruler of the kingdom, the sheer fact that he's talking this way tells us that he's ruler in alienation from his people and from his lands. So one of the things colonization does is it alienates the very people who are getting the most benefit from the joys of the gift of the land and the relationships of people they could have. And I think we need to press on that sometimes, politically and culturally. We have to ask, if you have hundreds of billions of dollars or whatever silly numbers we're starting to get to now, what does it alienate you from as much as what does it get you?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I've been trying to formulate how I would ask this question because I once was at a conference, not a conference, at an event where a senior and much awarded settler economist at an Ivy League university was talking about how to incentivize helping the poor, like how to make that profitable to rich people. And I mean, that's how I took it. And it was just the way he talked about it. It just kind of got to me. At the end, I said to him privately, do you think, like in your heart of hearts, that capitalism, as we've come to understand it, is the state of nature? Because he could not imagine, it just became clear as he talked, there was no other reality other than competition, scarcity. I mean, it was like Adam Smith and Hobbes' baby talking. And I just thought, and he paused for a moment. I said, because, you know, a lot of indigenous societies do not follow this model. And he said, that's true, but don't they always fall to capitalist societies? And I just thought, do you love with the human heart, or are we going to move on? But that was his comment. But don't they always fall to that? There's no real room in this world of competition, so they can practice what they want, but if it gets in the way of this modality, it won't stand a chance. And I just thought, what a chilling, but so when you use that term state of nature, all I could think of is kept going back to that conversation I had with that guy, a conversation that benefited neither of us.
Yeah.
But it came back, you know, in full when you were talking, and I just wonder, like, what do we do with that?
Man, I don't know. You know, like if I could answer that question well, I wouldn't be working as a Shakespearean. That's the God's honest truth. My first thought is that this is what we're talking about with the white possessive. That the white possessive takes a logic of scarcity and takes a logic that the only way we can avoid scarcity is by avoiding what's commonly called the tragedy of the commons. The idea of like, well, what if we have abundance? Then you might get a situation where someone takes too much. Well, you know, we have stories about someone taking too much. We have stories about deer people, for example, leaving areas, beaver people leaving areas because they were overhunted and overfished, and then we had to learn how to say thank you. We had to learn how to lure them back, sometimes through weird tricks, because stories are fun, but sometimes just through honestly acknowledging our mistakes. And when I hear that statement, you know what I think? I think we're in a moment where we are literally entering a sixth extinction, where we are destroying our planet, and we're tripling down on an economic system that does not work. And what does work is a gift economy. What works is an economy where we start seeing abundance, not in terms of what can I have and own, but what can I put in your pockets? You know, and here I think of the potlatch. And I think of like what marks you as wealthy in West Coast cultures. What can you give away? Not what can you keep? So to me, yeah, the logic of capitalism is let's incentivize helping our neighbors. You know what the incentive should be? Helping our neighbors. You know, like you don't need a tax break for that. You just need like to understand that your neighbor is yourself. It's that, you know, whenever I think of this, I think of James Baldwin's quote. I'm beginning to think that people who don't understand that all the children are ours are incapable of morality. And this, I think, ties into what we were talking about earlier. A lot of people within a capitalist logic, they don't see the children, they don't see the poor, they don't see the homeless, they don't see those without house as ours. And until we can see kinship with everyone, we're just going to find new ways to justify selfishness. And I guess I'm sort of working on this book project because I'm tired of engaging in logics that say, what if we do selfishness better? I just don't think there's a better way to do selfishness.
Hi, I just had a question. I was thinking about this moment in your talk about this unrealized production that you were talking about Chief Dan George, like this moment of him hypothetically playing Lear, and some of what was written in terms of the white producers or organizers' like intentions for the production. I was curious if in your scholarship on this you came across any of the performers who didn't end up playing those roles relationships to that moment in time.
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is no, I haven't. We have informal comments from George about what he thought about the whole thing. It doesn't sound like he was as thrilled to play Lear as other people were thrilled to see him play Lear. But it really feels like that production that went up at NIC was a who's who of Canadian Indigenous theater. Like, the names that were on that production were unbelievable. And the thing I want to really underline about the way they rehearsed it is it was a 3-month intensive rehearsal process where they brought everyone to Ottawa, they did full-day rehearsals, they did morning cultural exchanges of gifts, sort of learning about each other's communities, and then afternoons of intensive text work. And that created a whole collection of incredible Indigenous actors because the investment was made. But to your point about, like, what about those who weren't there? That's something I'm always thinking about with theater. And I'm thinking about how in theater, sometimes people who weren't there, sometimes people who aged out, sometimes people who weren't invited, you'll hear privately what they think, but we don't talk about it much publicly. So that's kind of why I'm really interested in talking about George and this very public sense of like someone who wasn't there as a way of reminding ourselves that this production was beautiful. It was an amazing production, but it's not the production it could have been. But it's also not an either or. We could have had the production that just went up a couple years ago and had one in the 80s with George on the stage, right? And I guess I want to think both end logics. But no, I don't have specifics to your question. I wish I did.
Jimmy, thank you so much. This was so wonderful. I've had long enough that this question it will be, but here we are. I was thinking about in Daniel's book that you put up, he narrates this moment from a colleague who was trying to get an Aboriginal literature certificate, I think, in a program in Australia.
Yeah.
And the dean responded, Aboriginal literature won't be worthy of kind of a study until they have a Shakespeare, which is impossible if you're not giving people the credit to do that. And I'm thinking too of like the way that you talked about Appalachian Palestine and the way that it is not the experience of Zionism that makes Palestinians indigenous. They are indigenous by virtue of these eons relationships with the land and the olive trees and all of these sorts of things. This is what makes them indigenous. And I was so struck, and have been in your other work too, about the way that you really deftly articulate Shakespeare as a vehicle to bridge these two gaps, or not gaps, but like two sides of the same coin. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more. I mean, you've talked about King Lear here, but how do you understand Shakespeare as a way, like how does it transcend that critique of it's Aboriginal literature is not worthy of study till they have a Shakespeare with these other sorts of things? And I'm thinking too of Scott's conversation with Natalie Diaz, where she talks about like, how do you study Shakespeare because these people are not made body by the land. So anyway, I just wonder if you could like say a little bit more about Shakespeare as the vehicle for the kind of really generous spirit you're talking about.
Well, first off, I just want to say, if we're talking about quality of literature, Canadian Indigenous literature wins all of the awards every year for a reason. It's not a DEI thing. It's winning it because it's excellent work. And it's excellent, it's exactly the way you were talking about in your talk. It's excellent work that is rooted in a particular politics. That's what makes it so good. And I can't wait to hear Tommy Orange speak. Do we have a Shakespeare? I would say oral storytelling traditions don't lend themselves to that. But we have a Thompson Highway. And if you don't know his work, go read it. Because it might not be a Shakespeare, but it's damn good. And I'm not sure Shakespeare was Shakespeare. I think that Shakespeare is a tool. And he is a tool that has been given an incredible amount of cultural prestige. And he is a tool that attracts funding like nothing else I've seen. I want to use the cultural prestige. I want to use the funding. I want to use the fact that, there's a Folger Shakespeare library. I want to use these things, and I want to start thinking about, can we put them to good work? And I'm deeply influenced by the kind of work that's been done at Race Before Race. I'm deeply influenced by people who've looked at Shakespeare's cultural position and then said, how do I leverage that to get into the conversation I want to get into? Another way of saying this is I just gave a King Lear talk that was suspiciously led on King Lear. That's intentional, right? King Lear is the opportunity to have the conversation I want to have. He's not the events. And I think that's the shift I'm trying to make. Because here's the thing. When I listen to settler directors talk about Shakespeare, they're doing the same thing, just they're doing it with a different politics. And then their art gets talked about in terms of excellence. It gets talked about in terms of how good is this. I think what we need to do is we need to make the politics of the strategic choice to use Shakespeare transparent and visible. And I think we need to encourage young artists to be brave and bold when they engage with Shakespeare's text, rather than seeing it as something fragile that might break you. And let's face it, man, if you talk to people who've done a run of King Lear can break you. That is a difficult, difficult role. But rather than thinking about reverence for the role, reverence for Shakespeare, I want to think about reverence for us. I want to think about the sacredness that happens when we get together in a space and exchange the gift of performance with one another. On that basis, I actually think there's a lot of room for us to get together and develop spaces of allyship and solidarity. We don't have to agree about everything, but we have to agree about the belief that there are some things that are sacred and the belief that there are some gifts that can't be priced. Once we agree to those two things, I think we have room to grow. And when I think of that, I think of a monologue like, David Tennant's doing To Be or Not to Be. That's a gift. There's no amount of money that makes that worth it. Do you know, yes, he got paid, and I'm happy he got paid, but man, that's not the way I would talk about the value of that. And I think that art allows us to imagine spaces where people get paid well for their work, but we start talking about value outside of a capitalist economic system.
Please join me in thanking Jamie.